Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema? Aye.
Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Blunt, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Blumenthal, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Hassan, Heinrich, Jones, Kane, Leahy, Menendez, Murray, Peters, Reed, Shaheen, Smith, Tester, Udall, Warren, and Wyden. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no.
Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Ms. Baldwin, no.
Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Yeah, I got you. Okay.
Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Coons, no.
Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune. Thank you. Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall. Yeah. Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Blumenthal, Booker, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Cassidy, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Gardner, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Johnson, Jones, Kane, Kennedy, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Lankford, Leahy, Manchin, McConnell, Menendez, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Paul, Perdue, Peters, Reed, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Schatz, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Bennett, aye. You did. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Collins, aye.
Feeling to have one non-Kansan here on your last hearing for Dr. Rosenzweig. Well, before I introduce him, I just wanted to say to you, Senator Roberts, how grateful I've been for your chairmanship, how much I've enjoyed personally, like every member of this committee, working with you on so many different things from ag machinery to the food supply. And I've so enjoyed your sense of humor. And we're going to miss that so much, but as noted, we'll see you there every single day when we're in the hearing. And one other thing I wanted to add, having been at your portrait unveiling, it's just incredible, the outpouring of love for you from your former staff, from members, former members. And that's a legacy that not everyone can have. So congratulations. And I know you're going to have a great retirement, and I have a feeling we're going to see you again. So Dr. Rosenzweig, our one and only Minnesotan here, is with us to talk about the work that Minnesota's General Mills is doing to invest in and promote regenerative agriculture as a way to overcome the challenges that are facing our farmers and food industry. He serves as Senior Agricultural Scientist at General Mills, where he leads research and outreach programs across North America to support farmers in implementing regenerative agriculture and to better understand how these systems impact the environment and also our farm economy. So both Senator Smith, who is also serves on this committee from the state of Minnesota, and I welcome you, Dr. Rosenzweig. Thank you very much, and thank you, Senator Roberts.